Exercise 5 deals with the classification of tissues. Excuse me. First of all, tissues is a group of cells that have similar structure and therefore similar function. They are working together to perform that particular function. Tissues then are going to be organized where you have at least two different types of tissues organized to form organs, then to also have a particular function. The study of tissues, that field is known as histology. We divide tissues into four primary types, and that would be epithelium, connective, nervous, and muscle. So if we start with the epithelial tissue, overall function is to help protect and absorb. Filtration and excretion and secretion are all important functions of these, as well as sensory reception. Now, some unique characteristics of epithelial tissue is what we refer to as polarity, meaning that the membranes have one free surface. So one surface, or one side of it will be free, that's called the apical surface. They tend to have very specialized contacts. They're going to be supported by connective tissue underneath them, underneath that. So you on one side have a free surface, underneath that's going to be connective tissue, called basement membrane. Epithelial tissue is avascular, meaning it does not have a blood supply to it, so it's going to be dependent upon the connective tissue, that basement membrane underneath, and diffusion of nutrients and gases from it. It is innervated, meaning it does have good nerve supply running through it, and it does tend to regenerate fairly easily as compared to other types of tissues. So how do we classify epithelial tissue? You're going to be classifying it according to how many layers it has, whether it's one layer, single layer, or whether it's multi-layered. And then what do the cells look like? So first, when we look at the layers, if it's only one layer thick, it is called simple epithelial tissue. If it's more than one layer, so it's multi-layered, it's called stratified. Then we look at what the cells look like. If they are cube-shaped, we call them cuboidal. If they're rectangular shaped, we call them columnar because they look like columns. And if they're kind of flattened and look like scales, they're called squamous. Now, with anything, you can have some variations within that. And so there are some that are known as pseudostratified. These are simple columnar, so they're rectangular, but they're varying heights. So it looks like it's multi-layered, but it's really only one single layer. So we call it pseudostratified. Oftentimes these will also be ciliated. So on that free open surface, they have cilia attached to them. Transitional, this is where the cells typically are round when the organ is in one type of situations. An example is with the bladder. So when the bladder is empty, the cells are going to look round. But when it's stretched out, the cells actually look like now they're flattened when they're stretched. So they change their shape. So that's why we call it transitional. So what you can do is put these wordings together so you can have simple squamous, which would be one layer of scale-like cells, or you could have stratified squamous, which would be multi-layered scale-like, or simple cuboidal or stratified cuboidals, simple columnar, stratified columnar. So by the name you can determine how many layers it is and what does it look like. So these are examples of where you can see such as here the cuboidal cells, the squamous cells, the columnar cells over here. Excuse me. The classification of epithelial tissue, whether it's glandular epithelium, glandular epithelium, endocrine versus exocrine. Endocrine are going to be ductless glands. They secrete hormones into extracellular fluid, which is then going to typically end up in the blood and be transported elsewhere in the body. Your exocrine, these retain their ducts, and so they're going to secrete the material into either the body surface or into a body cavity. Things such as your sweat glands or oil glands, the liver, the pancreas, etc. Connective tissue, the function of connective tissue is going to be for protection. It's going to help support, it's going to insulate, and it's going to help bind other cells, other tissues, excuse me, to adjacent tissues. The classification of connective tissue. First, we have connective tissue proper, which is then subdivided into loose versus dense connective tissue. For the loose connective, it can be subdivided even further into the areolar, adipose, or reticular connective tissue. The dense connective tissue is subdivided into dense regular, dense irregular, or elastic. You also have your cartilage, you have your bone, and you have blood, which blood is classified as a connective tissue. And these are just some pictures that are showing you. Do you need to be familiar with just getting a feel for connective tissue has probably the largest variety of types of tissue. And so you need to look at not only the cell, but what is the extracellular material, what we call the matrix. What's that material that's between the cells? What does that look like? For some cells, it's just mostly the cell. In this case, this is adipose, which is fat cells. And then over here, very distinctive, this is your bone. You have cells here, and then blood down here in this picture. The extracellular matrix, as I said, that is that material that's outside the cells, between the cells. It's being produced by the cells and then excreted out. It does help provide a lot of additional strength to that tissue. It's usually composed of two different substances. You've got ground substance versus fibers. The ground substance, that's interstitial fluid. You've got proteins in there and proteoglycans. And then the fibers help to provide support. It can be collagen fibers, it can be elastic fibers, it can be reticular fibers. It just depends on which type of tissue you are talking about. And that is something that's going to just take some practice of looking at different slides and learning how to recognize these different types of fibers, ground substance, and what the various types of connective tissues will look like. Nervous tissue, the function of that is to receive a stimulus and then generate an electrical impulse in response to that. There's two types of nervous tissue. You have your neurons. These are the cells that actually receive the stimulus and can generate the electrical impulse. And then the glial or neuroglial cells, these are the supporting cells. They support the neurons, they help to protect it, they help to insulate it, because you have an electrical current, think of it as moving along, so you need to insulate that. And so these are a couple of pictures here. These smaller structures here are showing the glial cells. This is the cell body here of a neuron. And once again, these are the neurons here, the cell bodies, these larger structures. And as you can see, they do have these extensions from them. That's what's helping to allow the electrical impulse to move from one area to another along those appendages or extensions. And then muscle tissue. So you have your epithelial, your connective, your nerve, and then now the last of the four types is the muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is specialized that it allows for contraction, and so therefore this allows for movement of the organism. There's three different types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. Smooth and cardiac are involuntary. For skeletal muscle, the cells tend to be very long and cylindrical. They're non-branching, and they're multinucleated. For smooth muscle, it tends to be spindle-shaped, and it's only got a single nucleus. Cardiac muscle is branched, and it has a single nucleus as well. Skeletal muscle is what we call striated. It looks like it has a striping pattern, as you'll see in just a moment. Cardiac muscle also is striated. Smooth muscle is not. And then cardiac muscle also has what we call intercalated disc, which is easily seen when you look at a microscope slide. So to distinguish between the three different muscle types, usually I recommend, for me just personally, you can see what works for you, is to look for the striations. Look for this branding pattern that you can see. You can see that little striping pattern. It's not present here. This is your smooth muscle. Only your cardiac and skeletal are striated. Smooth is not. And smooth tends to be more spindle shaped. So if you look at the striations, so you're able, this does not have it, so that means it's smooth muscle. Now these two, it's either skeletal or cardiac. How do you tell the difference? Skeletal, the cells tend to run and be aligned very parallel. There's no branching. Cardiac muscle, you have all of this branching that you see here. So that branching pattern tells me this is cardiac muscle. So that's one clue. The other clue is, see these little, they look like little white lines that are perpendicular here throughout. And as you can see on this blue arrow that is marked, those are the intercalated disc. That is present only in cardiac muscle. So this just gives you a brief review of the four different types of tissue. As I said, histology is the study of tissues, so it takes quite a bit of practice to be able to look at a slide and be able to determine what type of tissue is that. So just start reviewing that so that you're familiar with the four different types, and then within each type, the different categories.